White officers confront a black judge, accusing him of stealing his own car. This is a stolen vehicle. Step out of the car. A quiet night in an upscale neighborhood. Judge Ethan Carter grips the wheel of his brand new luxury car as two white officers stand outside, hands on their holsters. He knows how this ends for men who look like him. It doesn't matter that he's a federal judge. Tonight, he's just another black man being forced to prove he belongs. Have you ever witnessed injustice like this? Ever been judged before you could speak? Tell me your story in the comments. And don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. The steady hum of jazz filled the sleek interior of Ethan Carter's brand new Mercedes as he cruised down the quiet, tree-lined streets of Oak Ridge Heights. The leather seats still held the scent of fresh upholstery, and the soft glow of streetlights reflected off the polished dashboard. It had been a long day at the courthouse, but as he drove past manicured lawns and multi-million-dollar estates, a sense of accomplishment settled over him. Years of relentless dedication had finally brought him here, to one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the city. But that moment of peace was abruptly shattered. Flashing red and blue lights ignited in his rearview mirror, accompanied by the sharp wail of a police siren. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a stop sign, so why was he being pulled over? With a measured sigh, he flicked on his turn signal and eased the car to the curb. His heartbeat remained steady. This wasn't the first time he had been stopped without reason. As he lowered the window, two figures approached. Officer Karen Mitchell led the way, her sharp blue eyes scanning him with immediate suspicion. Her hand rested lightly on the holster at her hip, a silent but deliberate statement. Behind her, Officer Tom Briggs was broader, his posture rigid, radiating an unspoken hostility. "License and registration," Mitchell demanded, her tone clipped, void of courtesy. Ethan complied, reaching for his wallet with slow, deliberate movements. He had been in too many courtrooms, heard too many cases, to risk being seen as a threat simply for moving too quickly. As he handed over the documents, he kept his voice calm. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" Mitchell ignored the question, snatching the paperwork from his hand. She examined it, her eyes narrowing slightly before flicking back to him. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." A frown creased Ethan's forehead. "Excuse me?" Briggs stepped forward, his presence suddenly more imposing. "You heard her? Step out of the car. Now!" Ethan remained seated, his mind racing. "Officers, I don't understand." "Out! Now!" Mitchell's hand tightened on her holster. The threat was clear. Suppressing the flare of irritation rising in his chest, Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed open the door. The cool night air hit his skin as he stepped onto the pavement. He was keenly aware of his surroundings now. The stillness of the neighborhood, the warm glow of porch lights in the distance, and the faint movement of curtains in the houses lining the street. People were watching. A shadow flickered behind a window across the street, and he could almost hear the unspoken words forming behind closed doors. "Who is that? What did he do?" Briggs wasted no time. He grabbed Ethan's shoulder and spun him around, slamming him chest first against the cool metal of the car's hood. The force of it stole Ethan's breath for a moment. "This is unnecessary," Ethan protested, his voice measured but firm. "You fit the description of a suspect in a vehicle theft," Mitchell said, her tone devoid of emotion as she began patting him down. Ethan let out a slow breath, clenching his jaw. "I can assure you, this car was not stolen. I purchased it 3 days ago. If you check the registration, save it for the station." Mitchell cut him off, already reaching for her handcuffs. A dull, simmering anger spread through Ethan's chest. He knew his rights. He knew the law better than most. Yet in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. He took a steadying breath. "Officer Mitchell," he said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Before you do anything you might regret, I suggest you call your superior. Captain Daniel Roberts knows exactly who I am." Mitchell hesitated. Her fingers hovered over the handcuffs, her confidence wavering just slightly. Briggs, however, was unmoved. "You expect us to believe you're some big shot?" he scoffed. "I expect you to do your job properly," Ethan replied coolly, "which includes verifying my identity before making a wrongful arrest." Mitchell studied him for a long moment, then exchanged a glance with Briggs. Something about Ethan's composure, his unwavering calm, the steadiness in his gaze, seemed to give her pause. Finally, she exhaled sharply and grabbed her radio. "This is Officer Mitchell," she said, her voice crackling through the radio's static. "Requesting verification on a subject. Claims to be Judge Ethan Carter." A tense silence followed. Then, a gruff voice responded. "Mitchell, stand down, immediately." Mitchell stiffened. "Judge Carter is a federal official and a respected member of the community," the voice continued. "I'm on my way." The color drained from Mitchell's face as she lowered her radio. She looked back at Ethan, a flicker of unease in her expression. Your Honor, there seems to have been a misunderstanding. Ethan slowly straightened his jacket, regaining his composure. A misunderstanding. That's what they were calling it. Briggs, still standing beside him, muttered something under his breath before taking a calculated step back. A moment later, another squad car pulled up. The door swung open, and Captain Daniel Roberts emerged, his expression a mixture of irritation and quiet regret. "Judge Carter," he called as he approached, "I can't begin to apologize enough for this incident." His tone was serious, but Ethan could hear the frustration beneath it. Ethan met his gaze, his mind already racing with the implications of what had just happened. This wasn't just about him. This was about every black man who had been pulled over for driving while black. Every person of color who had been humiliated, accused, or arrested without cause. It was about a system that allowed officers like Briggs to operate unchecked. A system that, despite his success, still saw Ethan as a suspect first and a citizen second. Roberts turned to Mitchell and Briggs, his expression dark. "I'll be dealing with both of you later." Ethan should have felt relieved, but instead, there was only a dull ache in his chest, because he knew that after tonight, nothing would change, not unless he did something about it. He took a deep breath, then looked Roberts square in the eye. "Captain," he said, his voice steady, resolute, "I'd like to speak with you and Officer Mitchell, not as a victim, but as someone who believes we can turn this unfortunate incident into an opportunity for growth and change." Roberts blinked, caught off guard by the request, but then, slowly, he nodded. "Of course, Your Honor. Whatever you need." As they walked toward Robert's car, Ethan's mind was already spinning with ideas. Could this moment be the catalyst for real change? Or would it be just another footnote in a long history of injustice? Little did he know, this was only the beginning, and the road ahead would be far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. Ethan could walk away from this, but how many others had endured the same treatment without the power to fight back? Ethan sat alone in his study, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting elongated shadows across the mahogany furniture. A crystal glass of bourbon rested untouched beside a stack of legal briefs, his mind too preoccupied to even take a sip. The night's events replayed in his head like a looped recording, the cold metal of the car's hood pressing against his chest, the quiet murmurs of unseen neighbors watching from the safety of their homes, the way Officer Briggs had manhandled him without hesitation, without fear of consequence. His status as a federal judge had saved him, but what if he had been just another black man in a nice car? No title, no connections. He had spent his career believing that the system could be fixed from within, that justice wasn't just an ideal, but a process, one that required patience, diligence, and unwavering faith. But standing on the sidewalk with his hands on his own car, treated like a criminal, that faith had wavered. For the first time in a long time, he asked himself, was he wrong? 2 nights later, the annual Oak Ridge Heights Community Social took place at a lavish estate overlooking the lake. Ethan had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 3 years, but this was the first time he seriously considered skipping the event. Still, he knew that avoiding the situation wouldn't solve anything. So he dressed in a tailored navy suit, forced a polite smile, and walked into a ballroom filled with familiar but distant faces. The room hushed slightly when he entered, not enough to be obvious, but just long enough for him to notice. Conversations resumed, but he felt the weight of curious glances and subtle whispers. He made his way toward the bar, nodding at a few acquaintances, but most interactions were strained, their pleasantries hollow. "Ethan, glad you could make it," a voice called from behind. He turned to see Richard Adams, a longtime resident of the neighborhood and one of the self-appointed leaders of the community. With his salt and pepper hair, custom-tailored blazer, and ever-present air of smug authority, Richard had always made it clear that he preferred a very specific type of neighbor. Ethan accepted the offered handshake, noting the too tight grip that lingered just a moment longer than necessary. "We were all terribly sorry to hear about your incident the other night," Richard said, his tone carefully measured. "Really unfortunate." "Was it?" Ethan asked, arching a brow. Richard's smile didn't falter, but his eyes gleamed with something less than genuine sympathy. He took a sip of his scotch before continuing. "You know, I think it's just a misunderstanding. The officers were probably on edge. Crime rates aren't what they used to be, and people get uneasy." He paused, then added, I suppose they just wanted to make sure you belonged here." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he refused to let his expression betray his irritation. The message was clear. No matter his achievements, his status, or his contributions to society, to some people, he would never truly fit in. Before he could respond, a couple nearby chimed in, trying to shift the conversation, but the damage had been done. Ethan excused himself, the frustration simmering just beneath his calm exterior. He stepped outside onto the terrace, inhaling deeply, trying to dispel the tension wrapping around his chest. Why should he have to prove himself to people who had already made up their minds? Why should he have to swallow the indignity of that traffic stop when he knew countless others faced far worse, without the protection of a judge's title to shield them? He thought of young black men pulled over for no reason, of families mourning loved ones lost to police brutality, of courtrooms filled with defendants who never truly stood a chance against a system stacked against them. And suddenly, he knew he couldn't just let this go. If even he wasn't safe from bias and wrongful treatment, what did that say about the millions of others who lacked his influence? The next morning, he contacted Captain Daniel Roberts. Inside the downtown police precinct, Ethan sat across from Roberts in a small office. The captain's face was drawn, his normally confident demeanor subdued. "You're putting me in a tough position, Judge," Roberts admitted, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes. "I can't exactly go around accusing my officers of racial profiling." "I'm not asking you to," Ethan interrupted. "I'm asking you to be part of a solution." He laid out his proposal, a mandatory anti-bias training program for officers in the department, a ride-along initiative, allowing judges and community leaders to experience firsthand how policing is done in different neighborhoods, a review panel of civilians and legal professionals to oversee misconduct reports. Roberts exhaled slowly. "You do realize this is going to piss off a lot of people, right?" Ethan's expression remained firm. "Good." After a long pause, Roberts nodded reluctantly. "Fine. I'll back this." Not everyone was as receptive. When Officer Karen Mitchell heard about the initiative, her reaction was immediate and furious. "This is bullshit," she snapped in a department meeting. "I didn't do anything wrong." "No one's saying you did," Roberts replied, though his patience was clearly thinning. "This is about addressing the bigger picture." Mitchell scoffed, shaking her head. "So now we all have to sit through sensitivity training because some judge got his feelings hurt?" Ethan, seated quietly until now, finally spoke. "This isn't about feelings," he said evenly. "It's about ensuring that officers recognize their biases before those biases turn into misconduct." Mitchell folded her arms, glaring. "You really think sitting in a classroom for a couple of hours is going to change anything?" "No," Ethan admitted. "But it's a start." The tension in the room was palpable. Some officers nodded in agreement. Others looked away uncomfortably. Mitchell, however, remained defiant. "You can force me to sit through your lectures, Your Honor," she said, voice laced with sarcasm. "But you'll never change how people think." Ethan met her gaze head-on. "That's where you're wrong." Later that night, as Ethan locked up his office, a sense of unease settled in his gut. Something felt off. He dismissed it as exhaustion, but as he stepped into the parking garage, he noticed a black SUV idling in the shadows. Its headlights were off, but he could feel eyes on him. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, his phone buzzed. Another anonymous message. "You don't want to do this, Judge. Walk away before it's too late." Ethan exhaled slowly. He had expected resistance. He hadn't expected threats. Someone, maybe multiple people, wanted him to stop before he got too deep, before he uncovered something they didn't want seen. But who? And more importantly, how far would they go to silence him? Ethan thought he could change the system, but someone wanted to silence him before he even had the chance. Ethan sat in his dimly lit office, skimming through case files on his laptop when his phone vibrated against the wooden desk. The screen flashed with a text from an unknown number. "Watch your back, Judge." He stared at the message for a long moment, his grip tightening around the phone. This wasn't the first time he'd faced hostility, but this was different. This wasn't a disgruntled defendant or a bitter attorney. This felt deliberate, a warning or a threat. He considered ignoring it, chalking it up to intimidation tactics, but something about the timing unsettled him. He had only just proposed the anti-bias training program, and already someone was trying to dissuade him from pursuing it. Coincidence? Unlikely. Ethan quickly took a screenshot of the message and forwarded it to Marcus Reynolds, his closest friend and a seasoned detective. "Need a trace on this number," quietly. A reply came almost immediately. "On it. Be careful." Ethan exhaled and set the phone down, running a hand over his face. He'd barely begun this fight, and already the shadows were moving against him. The following afternoon, as Ethan pulled into his driveway, he noticed a familiar figure lingering near his front steps. Tommy Wilson. The 11-year-old shifted nervously from foot to foot, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie. Ethan stepped out of his car and approached the boy. "Tommy, everything okay?" Tommy hesitated, then glanced over his shoulder as if making sure no one else was around. "My dad's mad at you," he blurted out. Ethan's brows furrowed. "Jack?" Tommy nodded quickly. "I heard him on the phone last night. He was yelling about you, saying something about how you needed to be taught a lesson." Ethan crouched to meet the boy's gaze. "Did he say who he was talking to?" Tommy shook his head. "I don't know. He just sounded really mad. Said you were sticking your nose where it didn't belong." The words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Jack Wilson had always been the kind of man who operated in the gray areas of the law, pushing boundaries, cutting corners. He wasn't stupid enough to make direct threats, unless he felt truly threatened himself. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on Tommy's shoulder. You did the right thing telling me this. But listen, you need to be careful, all right? Don't mention this to anyone else. Tommy swallowed hard and nodded. Okay. As the boy turned and ran back toward his house, Ethan stood, his jaw tightening. Jack Wilson was involved in this. The only question was how deep it went. That night, Ethan sat across from Marcus Reynolds in the detective's modest apartment. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. You're not going to like what I found. Ethan arched a brow. Go on. Marcus spun his laptop around, showing a series of bank transactions. Apex Builders, Jack Wilson's company, has been moving money through a series of shell accounts, large amounts. And some of those accounts, he pointed at the screen. They're linked to political figures, police brass, even a couple of judges. Ethan's stomach turned. Bribery? Marcus nodded. Looks that way. And here's the kicker. Some of these transactions coincide with cases you ruled on. Cases where Apex Builders had violations but somehow avoided serious penalties. Ethan exhaled sharply, his mind racing. So they've been buying their way out of consequences. Exactly. Marcus tapped the keyboard, bringing up another file. And remember that text you got? The number's a burner phone. But guess where the last few calls went? Ethan leaned forward. Tell me. Marcus locked eyes with him. A police precinct. Someone on the inside is watching you. Ethan sat back, the weight of the revelation settling over him. He had suspected corruption, but this was bigger than just one company cutting corners. This was systemic, and now he was in the middle of it. As Ethan left Marcus's apartment, a light drizzle had started to fall, the wet pavement reflecting the neon glow of the city. He pulled his coat tighter around him and strode toward his car, still digesting the information he'd just learned. Then, he noticed a black SUV parked across the street, engine idling, headlights off. The moment he stepped off the curb, the vehicle's brake lights flared, and it slowly began moving forward. A tail. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had no way of knowing who was inside, but after what Marcus had uncovered, he wasn't about to wait and find out. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out fast. The SUV followed. His heart pounded as he took a hard right onto a side street, watching in the rearview mirror as the vehicle mimicked his turn. He pressed harder on the gas, weaving through traffic, testing whether they were truly following. They were. Whoever was in that car, they weren't trying to be discreet anymore. A high-speed chase through the city streets unfolded. Ethan took another sharp turn, tires screeching against the wet asphalt. The SUV kept pace, closing in. Then, up ahead, a construction site. A split-second decision. He veered left, cutting through the barricades and onto the partially paved road. The SUV hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Ethan punched the accelerator, shooting through the site and onto another main road. By the time the SUV maneuvered around the debris, he had already put several blocks between them. A few more turns, and the tail was gone. Ethan exhaled, gripping the steering wheel, his chest rising and falling rapidly. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. They had tried to box him in, and if he hadn't reacted fast enough, he didn't want to think about what might have happened. He pulled over, catching his breath. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. You good? Ethan swallowed hard before typing back. I think I just met our friends in the shadows. He had uncovered something bigger than he ever imagined, and far more dangerous than he was prepared for. Ethan arrived at the courthouse early, his mind still replaying the events of the previous night. The chase, the SUV, the warning text. Someone was watching his every move. But as soon as he stepped into the building, he realized that something was different today. The usual greetings from court staff were absent. Conversations hushed as he passed. Even the clerks, who had worked alongside him for years, exchanged uneasy glances. Then he saw it, his name, plastered across the morning headlines. Federal Judge Ethan Carter under investigation for corruption. Ethan grabbed a newspaper from the receptionist's desk. The article was riddled with accusations of bribery, improper rulings, and financial misconduct. Allegedly, he had accepted money in exchange for lenient sentences and had undisclosed connections to certain real estate developers, one of them being Apex Builders. His blood ran cold. This was a smear campaign, carefully orchestrated. Someone had planted this story to destroy his credibility, and it was working. He barely had time to process the shock before his office door swung open. Captain Daniel Roberts stood in the doorway, looking grimmer than Ethan had ever seen him. Close the door, Ethan said, voice low. Roberts complied, shutting them off from the murmur of courthouse gossip. He ran a hand over his face before finally speaking. This is bad, Ethan. No kidding, Ethan muttered, tossing the newspaper onto his desk. I assume you're not here just to read the headlines with me. Roberts exhaled heavily. There's an official internal investigation into you. The ethics committee has already been briefed, and the district attorney's office is involved. Ethan stiffened. On what ground? They claim to have financial records linking you to bribery. Transactions that suggest you accepted money in exchange for rulings that benefited certain businesses. And let me guess, Ethan said darkly, one of those businesses is Apex Builders. Roberts nodded. Ethan leaned back in his chair, hands clasped together as his mind raced. This was bigger than just intimidation. This was an outright attempt to eliminate him from the system. The most infuriating part, there was no real evidence, because there couldn't be. He had never taken a bribe in his life, but the truth didn't matter. The accusation alone was enough to destroy him. The official ethics inquiry began that afternoon. Ethan sat across from 3 members of the Judicial Review Board, individuals he had known professionally for years. But today, their expressions were unreadable, their gazes distant. A woman at the center of the panel, Margaret Lawson, adjusted her glasses and looked at him sternly. Judge Carter, you are being investigated for allegations of financial misconduct. Do you understand the severity of these charges? Ethan met her gaze, unflinching. I do. And I'd like to know what actual evidence you have to support these accusations. There was a pause, a flicker of hesitation. Then another board member, Judge Alan Whitmore, spoke. The transactions in question were flagged by an independent financial watchdog. Several large deposits were made to an offshore account that, according to preliminary reports, is linked to you. Ethan narrowed his eyes. That's a lie. We will determine that through this investigation. No, Ethan said, his voice firm. I mean, those accounts aren't mine. They've been fabricated. Lawson sighed. That's why this process exists, to determine the truth. Ethan clenched his jaw. The truth? This wasn't about truth. This was a performance, a formality before they tore him down. As the questioning dragged on, Ethan realized something even more chilling. No one in that room wanted to hear his defense. They had already made up their minds. That evening, Ethan forced himself to attend a charity gala he had previously committed to. With his name making headlines, backing out would only make him look guiltier. The event was held in a grand ballroom, chandeliers casting golden light over a sea of expensive suits and glittering gowns. The chatter was light, the champagne flowing freely. But as soon as Ethan walked in, the conversations dimmed. The whispers started. He grabbed a drink from the bar, ignoring the subtle glances and forced smiles. He knew what they were thinking. They had already convicted him in their minds. Then, a familiar voice cut through the noise. Jack Wilson, Judge Carter, Wilson drawled, his voice smooth, amused. I was wondering if you'd still show your face tonight. Ethan turned, meeting the man's smirking expression. Wilson was dressed in a tailored navy suit, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked relaxed, confident, too confident. Ethan took a slow sip of his drink before replying. I'm not one to run from baseless accusations. Wilson chuckled. Ah, yes, baseless. And yet, he gestured around the room, where eyes were still darting toward them. Perception is a funny thing, isn't it? Ethan exhaled sharply. Tell me something, Jack. How much did it cost to orchestrate this? Wilson's smirk widened, but his eyes remained cold. I have no idea what you're talking about. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. This won't work. Whatever game you're playing, I will find out who's pulling the string. Wilson swirled his whiskey lazily. You still don't get it, do you? His voice dropped just enough that only Ethan could hear. No one gets through this system clean. You either play along, or you get buried. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to remain composed. Wilson tilted his glass slightly in a mock toast. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Judge. Then he turned and walked away, mingling effortlessly back into the crowd. Ethan stood there for a moment, his pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't just about ruining his career. They wanted him gone, one way or another. Ethan understood that if he wanted to protect himself, he had to uncover the truth before those in power buried it forever. Ethan sat in the dimly lit back room of a rundown diner on the outskirts of the city, the scent of stale coffee and fried food lingering in the air. Across from him, Marcus Reynolds and Officer Karen Mitchell hunched over a laptop, their faces illuminated by the bluish glow of the screen. What are we looking at? Ethan asked, his voice steady, despite the weight of what they were about to uncover. Marcus typed in a few commands, pulling up a network of bank transactions. He gestured toward a cluster of highlighted records. These accounts were created under different names, but the money flows tell the real story. Ethan leaned in. The data showed a direct financial pipeline between Apex builders and high-ranking officers in the police department. Mitchell let out a low whistle. Damn, that's not even subtle, Marcus nodded. They got sloppy. Most of the funds were funneled through a series of dummy corporations, but someone on their end got careless. See this? He pointed at a name buried in the documents. This account is under Deputy Chief Samuel Richards. Ethan's brows furrowed. Richards was Captain Robert's superior, the man who had the power to kill or bury internal investigations. If Richards is on Apex's payroll, Ethan murmured, then every single case involving them was compromised. Mitchell sat back in her chair, crossing her arms. So, let's say we take this to IA or the DA's office. What do you think happens next? Ethan exhaled slowly. It disappeared. Marcus shut the laptop with a quiet click. Exactly. He glanced toward the diner window, scanning the parking lot. His voice lowered. We need physical proof. Something so undeniable that they can't sweep it under the rug. Mitchell raised an eyebrow. And where exactly do we find that? Marcus hesitated, then said, the law firm that represents Apex builders. Ethan tensed. He knew where this was going. That's a high-security office, he said. Surveillance, motion sensors. We'd need to break in. Mitchell smirked. Well, lucky for you, I know a thing or two about bypassing security. Ethan glanced between them. This is insane. Marcus gave a small shrug. You want to take them down or not? Ethan sighed. He already knew the answer. Before they could act, Marcus received an unexpected call from a confidential informant inside the department. A patrol officer named Luis Ortega, who had been feeding Marcus information off the record for years. They met in the back of a parking garage, shadows stretching under flickering fluorescent light. Ortega was nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot as he spoke. You guys don't have time, he said, his voice urgent. There's a cleanup order going around the department. Ethan's stomach tightened. Meaning? Meaning Richards has ordered all evidence tied to Apex builders to be wiped from department systems. Paper trails, digital records, witness statements, everything. It's happening tonight. Mitchell cursed under her breath. They're tying up loose ends. Ortega nodded. And if you're one of those loose ends? His voice trailed off. But the message was clear. Ethan exchanged a glance with Marcus. If they didn't move now, they'd lose their chance. It was 2 a.m. when Ethan, Marcus, and Mitchell stood outside the towering law offices of Harper Downey LLP, the firm that handled Apex Builders' legal affairs. Mitchell crouched by the security panel near the side entrance, working quickly to override the system. Give me 30 seconds, she whispered. Ethan scanned the street, his pulse steady, but alert. How much time will we have? Marcus adjusted the strap on his duffel bag. 10, maybe 15 minutes before someone notices something's off. The lock clicked. The door swung open. They moved quickly through the darkened corridors, heading for the records room. Mitchell's training as a cop proved useful. She disabled a motion sensor along the way, ensuring their presence wouldn't trigger alarms. Inside the records room, Marcus got to work on the computers, while Ethan rifled through physical files. Then, a sound stopped them cold. Footsteps. Someone was in the building. Ethan froze, exchanging a quick look with Mitchell, who instinctively reached for her sidearm. Marcus quickly shut the laptop. A flashlight beam swept across the hallway just outside. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before they were caught. Mitchell acted first. She grabbed a random legal folder, opened it, and shoved it into Marcus's hand. Whatever's in here, we say we're investigating it for an unrelated case, she whispered. If we get stopped, we bluff. The footsteps grew louder. Ethan scanned the room, his mind racing. If the intruder was security, they could possibly talk their way out. But if it was someone cleaning up Apex's mess, talking wasn't an option. Suddenly, Marcus pointed to a window. We go now. Ethan hesitated. We're on the 3rd floor? Marcus smirked. Yeah, I know. With no time to argue, they climbed out onto the narrow ledge, moving carefully along the building's side. Below, the alley was empty, except for Marcus's parked car. A door slammed open behind them. Whoever was inside had realized they weren't alone. Go, Ethan urged. They jumped down onto a fire escape, then scrambled to the ground. No sooner had they hit pavement than they heard the sound of a gunshot inside the building. "Shit, they're not playing," Mitchell muttered. Marcus tossed Ethan the keys, then shouted, "Drive!" They piled into the car, and Ethan gunned the engine. As they sped down the alley, a black SUV screeched around the corner, blocking the exit. "Brace yourselves," Marcus warned. Then, in one smooth motion, he jerked the emergency brake, sending the car into a sharp, controlled skid. The SUV tried to follow suit, but Marcus timed it perfectly. They clipped the front bumper of the pursuing vehicle, sending it spinning into a dumpster. Ethan didn't hesitate. He floored the gas, tearing through the streets. Behind them, the SUV struggled to recover, but it was too late. They had gotten away. For now. 20 minutes later, they regrouped at an abandoned warehouse Marcus sometimes used as a safe spot. Ethan tossed the stolen legal folder onto the table. "What did we even take?" Marcus flipped it open, skimming the contents. Then his eyes widened. "Holy shit," he breathed. Mitchell leaned over his shoulder. "What?" Marcus looked up at Ethan, his expression dead serious. "This isn't just financial records." He tapped a document inside. "This is a list of every officer, judge, and politician Apex Builders has on payroll." Ethan's pulse quickened. This was bigger than he imagined. This wasn't just about covering up bribes. This was a full-blown network of corruption, one that stretched into every corner of the justice system. Mitchell sat back, running a hand through her hair. "Well, we just signed our own death warrants." Ethan exhaled slowly. He knew she wasn't exaggerating. They had proof now. But if they went public, they'd be signing their own execution orders. They had the evidence, but revealing it now would be suicide. The atmosphere inside the car was tense, the air thick with urgency. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, gripping his phone as he scrolled through the files they had retrieved. Beside him, Marcus Reynolds adjusted the rearview mirror, eyes flicking between the road and the side streets. In the driver's seat, Officer Karen Mitchell kept both hands on the wheel, her usual sharp confidence replaced by a quiet focus. The stolen documents sitting in Ethan's briefcase weren't just incriminating, they were explosive. The corruption they exposed reached not only into the police force, but also City Hall and multiple judges' offices. This wasn't just about Apex Builders anymore. This was about a network of power that had been operating in the shadows for years. They had debated their next move for hours after escaping the law office. Going through official channels was out of the question. Every authority figure who could act was either compromised or in danger of being silenced. That left only one option: take the story straight to the people. Channel 7. News had a reputation for fearless investigative reporting. If they could get on live television, expose the evidence before it could be buried, there would be no way for their enemies to contain the fallout. Mitchell took a sharp turn onto a side road, heading toward the station. The city lights flickered against the windshield, the streets eerily empty for this time of night. Then, Marcus stiffened in the back seat. "Something's off," he muttered. Ethan's grip on his phone tightened. "What do you see?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was scanning the side mirrors, watching as a pair of black SUVs appeared behind them, moving in sync. Mitchell cursed under her breath. "We've got company." Ethan twisted in his seat. The SUVs weren't trying to overtake them. They were positioning themselves strategically, closing the distance like wolves circling their prey. His phone buzzed. "Unknown number. Turn around. Now." Before Ethan could react, the first gunshot shattered the rear windshield. The second SUV surged forward, cutting them off. Gunmen in ski masks leaned out of the windows, opening fire. Bullets tore through metal, punching holes into the trunk and rear bumper. The sound of gunfire roared through the cabin. "Hold on!" Mitchell shouted. She jerked the wheel hard, sending the car into a sharp left turn onto an industrial road lined with abandoned warehouses. The sudden maneuver threw the shooters off, forcing them to reposition. "Who the hell are these guys?" Marcus yelled, ducking low in the back seat. "We don't have time to find out," Ethan said through gritted teeth. Another barrage of bullets struck the passenger side, shattering Ethan's window. Glass rained over him as he shielded his face with his arm. Mitchell gritted her teeth and floored the accelerator. The engine roared as they sped down the desolate road, but the SUVs stayed right on their tail. Then, another shot rang out. This time, followed by a pained gasp. Mitchell's body jerked forward. Ethan turned sharply. Karen! She gritted her teeth, one hand pressing against her left shoulder, where blood was already spreading across her jacket. I'm fine, she hissed. You're bleeding, Ethan said. And I'm still driving, she snapped, adjusting her grip on the wheel. Her knuckles were white, her breathing sharp and controlled. Marcus reached forward from the back seat, grabbing Ethan's briefcase. We're sitting ducks in this car. We need to get off the road, Ethan agreed. Marcus scanned the surroundings. Then he spotted something up ahead, a construction site. Take that ramp, he shouted. Mitchell didn't hesitate. She swerved hard toward an unfinished freeway on-ramp, sending the car flying over a rough patch of dirt. The first SUV tried to follow, but Mitchell's maneuver had given them just enough lead time. Marcus threw the car door open, raising his handgun. He fired 3 precise shots at the lead SUV's front tire. Direct hit. The vehicle veered off course, spinning wildly before crashing into a row of stacked steel beams. But the second SUV was still coming. Mitchell's breathing was ragged, her strength clearly fading. We're not going to outrun them forever, she murmured. Ethan clenched his jaw. She was right. Then he noticed something. A flatbed truck loaded with concrete slabs, parked just beyond the next turn. Marcus, Ethan said. We need to distract. Marcus followed his gaze and immediately understood. I've got an idea, Marcus said, but you're not going to like it. I already don't. Marcus didn't wait. As Mitchell took another turn, he threw the briefcase with all their evidence out the window, onto the flatbed truck. Ethan's stomach twisted. Are you insane? If they think the evidence is in the car, they won't stop coming, Marcus shot back. This way, we live to fight another day. Mitchell took one more hard turn, sending their car onto a narrow service road leading toward a tunnel underpass. The second SUV, still in pursuit, missed the turn, barreling past them straight into a parked fuel truck. The resulting explosion sent a shockwave through the air, engulfing the street in fire. Mitchell finally slowed, wincing as she pressed her hand harder against her wound. We lost them, Marcus confirmed, looking back at the blade. Ethan ran a hand over his face. For now, his briefcase was gone, but the evidence wasn't. It was sitting on a truck heading in the opposite direction, one they could track down later. Right now, the priority was survival. Ethan helped Mitchell out of the car, her steps unsteady but determined. Marcus quickly wrapped her wound in a strip of fabric from his jacket. You should be in a hospital, Ethan muttered. Mitchell shook her head. No hospitals. They'll find. Ethan exhaled. She was right. Whoever had sent those assassins wasn't going to stop. Marcus wiped blood off his forehead. We need a new plan. Ethan's gaze hardened. No, he said. We stick to the original one. Marcus frowned. You serious? Ethan's jaw clenched. They just tried to kill us. That means we're close to something they really don't want exposed. We can't back down now. Mitchell let out a dry, painful chuckle. That's real inspiring, Judge. But we just got shot at. Maybe we take 5 minutes before marching into a news. Ethan looked up at the distant city skyline, his mind already racing. This wasn't just about him anymore. The police, the politicians, the criminals in power. They had just made their move. And now, he had to make his. The police and the politicians had shown their hand. Ethan couldn't back down now. The city skyline loomed ahead, glowing with the distant hum of streetlights and neon signs. From their vantage point on a rooftop across the street, Ethan, Marcus, and Mitchell could see Channel 7 News headquarters, their intended destination. But something was very wrong. The entire block was locked down. Squad cars lined the street, their flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the glass windows of nearby buildings. Officers were stationed at every entrance, some in riot gear, others speaking into radio. Ethan could feel it, the heavy presence of an impending crackdown. This wasn't just a police perimeter. It was a trap. Mitchell, still pale from blood loss but standing firm, let out a low whistle. Well, looks like they were expecting it. Marcus exhaled sharply. There's no way we're walking through the front door. The second we step onto that street, we're done. Ethan's jaw clenched. He should have known they'd move faster than expected. The people they were up against weren't just corrupt. They were powerful, connected, and willing to use the full force of law enforcement to silence the truth. But they had come too far to turn back now. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the USB drive containing the incriminating files, and handed it to Mark. "If I don't make it," Ethan said, voice low, "you get this out, no matter what." Marcus stared at him. "You're not serious." Ethan's expression was unwavering. "I'm the target. If we all go in, we all get caught. But if I go alone—" Mitchell cut him off with a dry laugh. "If you go alone, you get yourself killed." Ethan looked down at the swarm of officers below. There were at least 24, maybe more. The main entrance was heavily guarded, and the side doors were likely blocked. But there was one way and they wouldn't expect. From above. His eyes moved toward the adjacent office building, just across from the Channel 7 rooftop. A 30-foot gap between the two. A ridiculous, dangerous jump, but it was his only shot. Marcus followed his gaze and immediately shook his head. "Oh, hell no." Ethan didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the edge. "Ethan, wait." And then he jumped. For a split second, there was nothing but air beneath him. The wind roared in his ears, the city below stretching out like an endless abyss. His body arced forward, his arms reaching. His hands slammed onto the ledge of the Channel 7 rooftop. His fingers scraped against the rough concrete as he struggled for grip. His right foot hit the side of the building, but he barely caught himself before slipping. His muscles screamed as he hauled himself up, swinging his leg over the edge. Then he was on the roof, alive, breathless, and completely alone. Ethan wasted no time. He sprinted across the rooftop toward the service door, yanking it open and slipping inside. The stairwell was empty. No guard. Good. He descended quickly, moving past utility rooms and storage areas, until he reached the news floor. Through a narrow glass window, he could see the broadcast studio, bright lights, cameras, and in the center of it all, Linda Parker, Channel 7's lead anchor. She was live on air, reading the news. This was it. But then, a voice echoed through the hall behind him. "Hold it right there." Ethan turned just in time to see two armed security officers rounding the corner. They moved fast, too fast. One of them lunged, trying to grab him, but Ethan sidestepped, slamming his elbow into the man's ribs. The second guard swung at him, and Ethan barely managed to duck before throwing a hard punch to the side of his head. The guard staggered backward, but more footsteps thundered down the hall. More were coming. Ethan made a split-second decision. He grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher, yanked the pin, and aimed. A thick cloud of white foam exploded into the air, engulfing the hallway. The guards coughed, momentarily blinded. Ethan used the distraction to slip past them, racing toward the news floor. He burst into the studio, the doors swinging wide. Linda Parker, mid-sentence, stopped talking. The camera operators froze. A murmur spread through the crew as they recognized him. Ethan's chest heaved as he stepped forward. "Linda," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos behind him. "I need to speak. Now." Parker blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Judge Carter." Then, the doors behind him slammed open again. More security, more officers. They had found him. "Cut the feed!" someone shouted. But Linda hesitated, looking between Ethan and the approaching officer. Ethan took a step closer to her, lowering his voice. "If you cut the feed, they'll bury this. They'll bury." She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. Then slowly, she turned back to the camera and did something no one expected. She gestured for the crew to keep rolling. The broadcast stayed live. Ethan exhaled. Then he turned toward the camera, knowing this was his only. He had to make every word count. He had one chance to bring the truth into the light. Ethan stood at the center of the newsroom, breathing hard, the bright studio lights nearly blinded. The Channel 7 logo glowed behind him on the massive screen. Camera operators exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to stop filming or wait for instructions. Linda Parker, still seated at the anchor desk, turned toward the lens. Her voice was steady, but the tension in the room was palpable. "We are here live with Judge Ethan Carter, who has just entered our studio with what he claims is evidence of widespread corruption in the city's justice system." Ethan stepped forward, his heart pounding, but his voice unwavering. "Thank you, Linda. What I'm about to reveal is a matter of life and death, not just for me, but for the people of this." Before anyone could stop him, he turned directly to the live camera feed and spoke with the force of someone who had nothing left to lose. This city has been held hostage by a network of corruption stretching from the police force to the highest offices of government. And I have the evidence to prove it. A murmur rippled through the newsroom. Even the security guards who had chased him in hesitated, listening now instead of advancing. Ethan continued. For years, powerful people have protected Apex Builders, a construction firm at the center of a vast bribery scheme. They have funneled millions in illicit money to police officers, politicians, and even judges, ensuring that violations disappear, cases are rigged, and contracts go to those willing to pay. And when someone gets in their way, they remove. The control room buzzed with activity. Producers were yelling into headsets, likely being pressured by external forces to cut the feed. But Linda Parker didn't move. She wasn't stopping it. Ethan pressed on. 3 days ago, I was falsely accused of corruption because I refused to play along. I have evidence, bank transfers, internal emails, signed contracts, showing how deep this runs. But the people behind this don't want you to know the truth. He turned to Linda. I'm willing to share everything. Right here, right now. Linda hesitated for only a second, then nodded, signaling to the control room. Put it on screen. The newsroom staff gasped, but the tech crew followed her orders. Within seconds, the documents Ethan had recovered, the wire transfers, the names, the bribery logs, flashed across every television screen broadcasting the live feed. And just like that, the truth was out. Then, the doors exploded open. A wave of tactical officers in riot gear stormed in, their weapons raised. Everyone down, one of them bellowed. Gasps and screams filled the studio. Camera operators scrambled for cover, and journalists ducked behind desks. A squad of heavily armed officers rushed toward Ethan, their boots thundering against the floor. But Linda Parker stood up, stepping between them and the broadcast crew. We are live, she said, her voice razor-sharp. If you take him now, you do it in front of millions of viewers. The lead officer hesitated. This wasn't a back-alley arrest. This was live national television. The control room director's voice crackled through the studio speakers. We are being watched by every major network, every news station. Social media is blowing up. If they take him down, the world will see. Ethan saw it in their faces. For the first time, the police weren't sure what to do. Then, Deputy Chief Samuel Richards himself walked. Ethan's chest tightened. The man at the heart of the corruption, the one pulling the strings. Richards's suit was crisp, but there was sweat on his brow. He had been forced into the light too soon, and he knew it. This is over, Judge, Richards said. You've said enough. Ethan took a step forward, his voice firm. You don't get to decide that anymore. Richards signaled to his men. Arrest! For a split second, no one moved. The country was watching. Then, 2 officers grabbed Ethan by the arms, twisting them behind his back. The cold steel of handcuffs locked around his wrist. Ethan didn't fight it, because he had already won. As they led him toward the door, a ringing phone echoed in the studio. Then another, and another. The producers, the journalists, the control room, everyone's phones were buzzing at once. Ethan didn't have to ask what was happening. The city was waking up. Across the country, people had seen the documents, the evidence, the truth. Social media was exploding with hashtags. Harsh, expose Apex. Justice for Ethan Carter. No more corruption. Protesters were already gathering outside Channel 7, their voices rising in a roar of defiance. Richard's face drained of color as his own phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at it, then at his men. This wasn't the victory he had planned. It was the beginning of his downfall. But could Ethan escape the walls closing in around? The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Ethan's wrists as the officers yanked his arms behind his back. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm, resolute. The studio lights glared down on the chaotic scene. Uniformed officers surrounding him, guns still drawn, while news anchors and staff stood frozen in. The cameras were still rolling. The whole country was watching. The lead officer's voice rang through the studio. Ethan Carter, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Ethan let out a sharp breath, then lifted his chin. I don't need to remain silent, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. The room fell. This is what corruption looks like, Ethan said, turning to face the cameras. His hands were bound, but his words were sharp as a blade. "They can arrest me, but they cannot arrest the truth." The moment those words left his lips, the station's control room exploded with activity. Phones were ringing nonstop. The newsroom staff were checking their devices, their eyes widening as they saw what was happening outside the station. Because the city was no longer watching inside. Outside the Channel 7 headquarters, hundreds of people had gathered, and the crowd was growing by the second. What had started as a few dozen onlookers had swelled into an impromptu protest. The streets were filled with people holding up their phones, recording, streaming live, shouting demands for justice. Then, a chant started. At first, just a few voices, then dozens, then hundreds. "Let him go! Let him go! Let him go!" The officers inside the newsroom hesitated, their grip on Ethan loosening just slightly. They had expected to silence him, to drag him out of public view before anyone could react. But they had miscalculated. The world had already seen too much. From inside the studio, Linda Parker turned to the control. "Are we still live?" she asked. The producer nodded frantically. "Every channel is carrying this now. Even the national network." Linda's grip on her desk tightened. "Then keep." The officers noticed. One of them muttered into his radio, clearly waiting for orders. Something was wrong. Richards had been so certain that this would be an easy takedown. But now, as his phone vibrated again in his pocket, his face turned pale. Because this wasn't going according to... Across the city, the news had spread like wildfire. In the courthouse, junior clerks gathered around televisions, whispering to one another. Some, who had once feared speaking out, now saw an opening. In police precincts, not all officers were pleased. Some shifted uncomfortably, realizing that their department was being exposed in real time. A few turned off the screen. Others watched in silence, their faces unreadable. And in the street, the protest kept growing. People poured out of apartment buildings, cafes, office buildings, all heading toward Channel 7. Their voices rose like a wave, demanding justice, demanding answers. What had started as a desperate move by Ethan had now turned into a movement of its own. And those in power? They were losing control of the narrative. Inside the newsroom, Richards took a slow step toward Ethan, lowering his voice so only he could. "You think this changes anything?" Ethan met his gaze head-on. "I think it already..." Richards's jaw clenched. He turned to the lead officer. "Get him out of here. Now." The officers... Ethan felt their grip tighten. But before they could drag him away, a sudden loud crash echoed through the... The front doors had been forced open, and the protesters were coming in. The officers instinctively turned toward the entrance. For a split second, their grip on Ethan weakened. Ethan didn't hesitate. He shoved backward, twisting his body just enough to throw them off back. Marcus and Mitchell burst through the studio doors at that exact moment, moving fast. "Time to go!" Marcus shouted. Mitchell, despite her injury, moved like a trained professional. She grabbed one of the guards by the wrist, twisted hard, and sent him sprawling to the floor. The newsroom descended into chaos. The protesters were inside now, pushing past security, chanting louder. The cameras were still rolling, broadcasting every second of it. Ethan and his team moved fast, weaving through the crowd as police scrambled to regain order. The officers had one goal: get Ethan back into custody. But the people had other plans. A group of protesters formed a wall, blocking the police's path just long enough for Ethan, Marcus, and Mitchell to slip out a side. The streets were a sea of people. Ethan had expected chaos. He hadn't expected to see his own name on signs, people chanting for him, people who had, just hours ago, never even heard of him. "They can't silence us," someone shouted. "We know the truth." Ethan felt it now. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger than one man, bigger than one case. They had tried to bury the truth. Instead, they had set the whole city on fire. Even though he had been arrested, Ethan had planted the seed of doubt in the public's mind, and that seed was growing fast. The protests didn't die down. If anything, they grew. What had started as a local demonstration in front of Channel 7 News had now turned into a full-scale movement. Across the city, thousands marched in the streets, demanding justice, accountability, and change. Social media was flooded with clips of Ethan's arrest, his speech on live television, and the damning evidence he had exposed. But it wasn't just the city watching anymore. The state government was forced to respond. Within 48 hours, the governor made a public statement announcing that an independent task force had been assembled to investigate the allegations of corruption. The Justice Department issued subpoenas. The Attorney General personally took charge of the inquiry. And then, the dominoes started to fall. The first major blow came when Jack Wilson was taken into custody. The charges were extensive: bribery, fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. His bank accounts were frozen. His company, Apex Builders, was shut down pending further investigation. The footage of his perp walk, hands cuffed, face twisted in rage, went viral instantly. Ethan watched it from a small holding cell in the downtown detention center, where he had been kept since his... The news anchor's voice echoed from the television in the corner. Jack Wilson, CEO of Apex Builders, was arrested this morning following an extensive corruption. Sources confirm that Wilson is cooperating with authorities in exchange for a possible reduced sentence. Ethan exhaled sharply. Wilson was flipping. That meant he was naming names, and he wasn't the only one. Just hours later, another high-profile arrest sent shockwaves through the city. Deputy Chief Samuel Richards, the man who had ordered Ethan's arrest, was led out of police headquarters in handcuffs, surrounded by federal... The official charge: racketeering, money laundering, abuse of power. His own officers watched in silence as he was shoved into the back of a black SUV, his once pristine uniform now a symbol of disgrace. Inside his cell, Ethan felt no satisfaction, only clarity. They had won a battle, but the war wasn't over. It was day 3 when the guards came for him. The cell door swung open and a familiar voice greeted him. "Looks like your time here." Ethan turned to see Marcus Reynolds standing in the hallway, arms crossed. Beside him was a representative from the Attorney General's office, holding a stack of legal documents. "They dropped the charges," Marcus said. "You're..." Ethan stood slowly, rolling the stiffness from his shoulders. "Just like that?" The lawyer, Sarah Chen, an old law school friend, nodded. "They had no case to begin with. But more important," she exhaled, "the public won't stand for your prosecution." Ethan followed them out, passing rows of holding cells, past officers who now wouldn't even look him in the eye. By the time he stepped outside, the streets were packed with people. A wave of cheers erupted the moment they saw him. Reporters shoved microphones forward, cameras flashed, and supporters chanted his name. Signs reading, "Justice for Ethan," "No more corruption," and "We stand with the truth," filled the air. He hadn't realized it until now. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was... That night, Ethan sat in Marcus's apartment, staring at a corkboard covered in case files, red strings, and pinned documents. Mitchell, still recovering from her wound, leaned against the kitchen counter, arms... "You did it," she said. "Richards is gone. Wilson's flipping. The whole damn system's on..." Ethan nodded, but his expression remained distant. Mitchell narrowed her eyes. "You don't look like a guy who just took down half the city's corruption network." Ethan ran a hand over his face. "Because it's not enough." Marcus sighed. "You're kidding, right? We just exposed a criminal empire. The feds are involved. Politicians are panicking. This is the biggest case in decades." Ethan turned to face them. "And what happens when the headlines change? When the cameras leave? When the public moves?" They fell silent. Because they all knew the truth. For every Jack Wilson that went down, another corrupt businessman would take his place. For every Deputy Chief Richards, there were others waiting to step into his role. The system wasn't designed to fail. It was designed to protect itself. And the moment Ethan let his guard down, it would swallow everything whole again. Marcus leaned forward, studying Ethan. "You're thinking about leaving the bench, aren't you?" Ethan exhaled. His entire career, he had fought from within the system. He had believed that justice was a process, a slow, difficult one, but still possible. But after everything, after seeing how easily the system had tried to erase him, how deep the corruption had spread, could he really keep playing by the same... Mitchell, "You stepping into politics, Judge?" Ethan chuckled, but the idea wasn't entirely ridiculous. Then Marcus's voice turned serious. If you step down as a judge, you'd have more freedom to fight. No restrictions. No bureaucracy holding you. Ethan ran a hand over his jaw. That was the decision before him now. Stay on the bench and fight the slow war from within. Or leave the system entirely and take the fight to the real enemy. Out in the weight of it settled on his shoulders. One path was safe. The other? It could change everything. He had to decide. Continue as a judge or fight the battle from the outside. The room was packed. Every major news network had sent a crew. Cameras were rolling, reporters were whispering, and the tension in the air was palpable. The press conference had been hastily arranged, but the anticipation had built for. Everyone wanted to know what Judge Ethan Carter would do. Ethan stood behind the wooden podium, staring out at the sea of journalists, activists, and concerned citizens. The city had been forever changed by what had happened. Corrupt officials had fallen. Protests had ignited a movement. But now, all eyes were on him. He adjusted the microphone, took a steadying breath, and spoke the words that would change his life forever. Effective immediately, he said, his voice steady. I am resigning from my position as a federal judge. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Journalists scrambled for their phones, rushing to break the news. I did not come to this decision lightly, Ethan continued. For years, I believed that I could create change from within the system. That justice, true justice, was possible if we worked hard enough, fought long enough, believed deeply enough. He paused, scanning the room. But after what I've seen, after what I've experienced firsthand, I can no longer pretend that the system will fix it. The murmurs in the room died down, and now everyone was listening. And this is not a retreat, Ethan said firmly. This is a new beginning. He stepped away from the podium and gestured to the large screen behind him, where a logo appeared. A bold, black and white emblem with 3 letters, JP. The Justice Public Integrity Initiative, Ethan announced. An independent watchdog organization dedicated to exposing corruption, holding officials accountable, and ensuring that justice serves the people, not just the. The reporters erupted with questions, their voices overlapping. Judge Carter, why leave the. Who's funding this initiative? What makes this different from existing oversight committees? Ethan held up a hand, calm and. I left the bench because the judiciary is bound by rules designed to protect itself. Because judges, even the good ones, are limited in what they can do, I will not be. The energy in the room shifted. This wasn't just a resignation. It was a declaration of war. After the press conference, Ethan sat in a downtown office space, a temporary headquarters donated by an anonymous benefactor. The place was bare bones, folding tables, mismatched chairs, stacks of documents scattered across desks. But it was real. It was happening. Marcus Reynolds leaned against the doorway, arms. Well, you sure know how to make an exit. Ethan smirked. You in? Marcus scoffed. You even have to ask? Behind him, Karen Mitchell walked in, her arm still bandaged from the gunshot. You realize this is insane, right? She said. Completely, Ethan replied. Mitchell exhaled. Then she pulled up a chair and sat down. Good. Ethan looked around at the people in the room, whistleblowers, reformists, legal minds, and activists. Many had been waiting for someone to take the lead. Now they had a cause to rally. A young journalist, Mia Brooks, one of the first to break the Apex Builders scandal, tapped on her. We've already received over 100 tips from city employees and citizens who want to come forward with information. People are ready. Ethan nodded, his mind already racing. Then let's make sure they have somewhere safe. Not everyone was happy about the Justice Public Integrity Initiative. Within hours of Ethan's announcement, powerful forces started pushing back. The mayor's office released a statement questioning his credibility. The police union called him a political agitator. Certain judges whispered that Ethan had become a liability to the profession. Even with Richards and Wilson gone, the old system was still fighting to protect. Mitchell tossed a folder onto the table in front of Ethan. This just. Ethan opened it. Inside was a sealed indictment, one that had never been pursued. The name on it? A sitting U.S. Senator. Marcus let out a low whistle. So, who wants to go? Ethan looked at the name again, then slowly closed the folder. The system wouldn't change easily. But now, they were ready for the long war. It was nearly midnight when Ethan Carter stood alone on the rooftop of his new office, looking out over the skyline stretched before him, the glow of streetlights flickering like stars against the darkness. It had been 3 weeks since he'd resigned from the bench, 3 weeks since he had walked away from the courtroom to take the fight directly to the people. In that time, the Justice Public Integrity Initiative, JPI, had already made waves. They had set up a secure tip line, launched independent investigations into dozens of corruption allegations, and forced local officials to answer for their unchecked power. The system was beginning to feel the pressure, but Ethan knew this was just the beginning. His phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glancing at Sarah. A sharp, competent federal prosecutor, Sarah had been one of the few people inside the government he still trusted. She had quietly helped push the corruption cases against Apex Builders and Deputy Chief Richards. And now, she was calling. "Tell me it's good." A short silence. Then Sarah's voice came through, low and "Depends on how you look at it," she said. "I've got something big. Corruption inside the mayor's office. And I mean deep." Ethan's expression hardened. "How deep? Misallocated funds, bribes disguised as campaign donations, illegal real estate deals, you name it. And we're talking millions." Ethan. Sarah hesitated. "Look, Ethan, you just took down some powerful people. They're still reeling. But if you go after the mayor's office now, you're making it clear that you're not just cleaning up the mess. You're dismantling the whole." Ethan smirked, gripping the railing of the rooftop. "That was exactly the plan. You're saying I should back off?" "I'm saying they won't let you walk away this time." A beat of silence passed. Then his phone buzzed again. A text message from "New corruption in the mayor's office." Ethan stared at the words for a moment. Then, slowly, a grin crept across his face. He typed back, "Always." Ethan Carter's journey began with a simple traffic stop, but it led him to uncover a web of corruption that ran deeper than he ever imagined. He lost everything: his reputation, his career, his sense of security. But in the end, he gained something far more powerful. He walked away from the bench, but he didn't walk away from justice. Instead, he took the fight to the streets, to the people, to the very foundations of power that had tried to silence him. But the question remains, can one man truly change a broken? What do you think? Is exposing the truth enough? Or does real change require some? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge the system and keep the conversation going. Justice is a fight that never ends, and together, we can make a difference.
Maya Carter's hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as she waited for the traffic light to turn green. The low hum of her car's engine filled the quiet, luxurious interior, contrasting with the chaos of the city street outside. She glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting her hair with a quick pat. It had been a long day, but she felt accomplished. Another win in court, another client saved from a system stacked against them. Her car, a sleek black BMW, was more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of how far she'd come. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, Maya had seen her mother work multiple jobs just to make ends meet. Now, as a 36-year-old defense attorney, she had built a career defined by hard work, resilience, and her unwavering commitment to justice. As the light turned green, Maya pressed the gas and merged into the flow of traffic. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the asphalt glistened under the late afternoon sun. She was only a few blocks away from her apartment when she noticed flashing blue lights in her rearview mirror. A frown formed on her face. "What is this about?" she muttered under her breath. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't run a red light. Her car registration and insurance were up to date. There was no reason to pull her over. She slowed down and guided her car to the side of the road, exhaling slowly as she turned off the engine. "Stay calm," she told herself. "This is probably nothing." Seconds later, the officer approached her window. He was tall, with a square jawline and piercing blue eyes that gave away nothing but cold authority. His badge glinted in the sunlight. "License and registration," he said, his tone clipped and devoid of any courtesy. Maya nodded and reached into her bag for her wallet. "Sure, officer," she said, keeping her voice polite. "May I ask what this is about?" The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes scanned her face, then drifted to her car interior, its leather seats, the pristine dashboard. He leaned slightly closer to the window. "Is this your car?" Maya blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Yes, it is." "Is there a problem?" His gaze hardened. "I'll be the one asking questions here, ma'am." Something in his tone made her stomach tighten. She handed over her license and registration, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. The officer studied the documents before glancing back at her. "Where are you coming from?" "I just left a meeting with a client downtown," Maya replied evenly. The officer's lips curled into a thin smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "A client, huh? And what kind of work do you do?" Maya hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "I'm an attorney." The officer raised an eyebrow, his skepticism palpable. "An attorney, huh? That's interesting." Maya felt a flare of irritation but suppressed it. "Is there a reason I've been stopped, officer?" she asked again, her voice steady but firmer this time. Instead of answering, he stepped back and motioned to his patrol car, where a second officer had just arrived on the scene. They exchanged a brief conversation, and the second officer, shorter, stockier, and equally stern-looking, walked toward Maya's car. The first officer returned, his expression darker now. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Maya's chest tightened. "Excuse me." "I said step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his tone sharper this time. Her instincts screamed at her to stay calm. "Officer, I've complied with everything you've asked. I've given you my license and registration. I'm not sure why this is necessary." He leaned down, his face now level with hers. "Step out of the vehicle, or I'll have to make you." A chill ran down her spine. Slowly, Maya unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. As she stepped out, she felt the eyes of passing drivers on her, some slowing down to gawk at the scene. The second officer stood by, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. The first officer gestured toward the hood of her car. "Hands on the hood," he commanded. Maya froze, her heart pounding. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Do it," he barked. She complied, placing her hands on the warm metal of the car's hood. Her breathing quickened as she heard the officer rifling through her belongings inside the car. "What are you looking for?" she asked, turning her head slightly. "Keep your eyes forward," the second officer snapped. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. Maya had faced her share of intimidating situations in the courtroom, but this was different. This was personal. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the first officer continued his search. Maya could hear the sound of her glove compartment being opened, her papers shuffled. Finally, he emerged, holding her briefcase in one hand. He set it on the hood of the car, just inches from where her hands rested. "What's in here?" he demanded. "Legal documents," Maya replied, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Confidential case files." "We'll see about that." The officer began opening the briefcase, ignoring her protests. "You can't do that," Maya exclaimed, straightening up. "That's a violation of attorney-client privilege." "Stay where you are," the second officer barked, stepping closer to her. Just then, a voice cut through the tension. "Hey, what the hell is going on here?" Maya turned her head to see a man standing on the sidewalk, holding up his phone. He was recording the interaction. "This woman didn't do anything," the man shouted. "I've been watching the whole time." The first officer stiffened. "Mind your business," he snapped at the bystander. "Oh, it's my business now," the man shot back. "You're harassing her for no reason, and I've got it all on video." Maya felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. The first officer slammed her briefcase shut and turned to her, his face a mask of barely contained anger. "You're free to go," he said through gritted teeth, tossing her documents onto the hood of the car. Maya stared at him in disbelief. "Free to go," she echoed. "After all of this?" He ignored her, walking back toward his patrol car. The second officer followed, muttering something under his breath. Maya stood there for a moment, her hands trembling as she gathered her things. The man with the phone approached her cautiously. "Are you okay?" he asked. Maya nodded, though her voice caught in her throat. "Thank you for recording that," she said quietly. The man nodded. "They're not gonna get away with this. I'll send you the video." As she climbed back into her car and drove away, Maya's mind raced. She felt humiliated, violated, but most of all, determined. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had ever been treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of their skin. She wasn't going to let this go. Maya stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The light overhead buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glare on her face. She splashed cold water onto her cheeks, letting it drip down her skin. Her heart was still racing, the events of the afternoon replaying in a nauseating loop. She had spent hours in court fighting for justice for others, but today she had been stripped of her dignity in the span of a few humiliating minutes. She dabbed her face with a towel, her fingers trembling as they brushed against her skin. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her back to the moment. It was a text from her assistant, Emma. "The video is blowing up on social media. Call me ASAP." Maya felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She picked up the phone and scrolled through the link Emma had sent. There it was, a grainy recording of her encounter with the police, filmed by the bystander. The caption read, "Another example of abuse of power. When will this stop?" The video had already racked up thousands of views, with comments flooding in by the second. "This is disgusting. How is this still happening in 2025? Sue them. Hold them accountable. I've had a similar experience with cops in this city. They don't care about the law, only their egos." Maya sat down heavily on the edge of her bed, scrolling through the comments. Some were supportive, others filled with anger, but a few were dismissive. "We don't know the full story. What if she was actually guilty of something? Cops don't stop people for no reason." Her jaw tightened. That last comment stung more than it should have. She was an attorney. She had seen firsthand how easily the presumption of innocence could be twisted depending on who was sitting in the defendant's chair. Taking a deep breath, she called Emma. "Maya," Emma said, picking up on the first ring. "This thing is blowing up fast. Are you okay?" "I don't know," Maya admitted. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, tired, but also laced with something sharper. Determination. "It's been a long day, but I can't just sit here and do nothing. I need to act." "Good," Emma replied. "Because you already have people rallying behind you. Activist groups are sharing the video. Journalists are calling the office asking for a comment. Even some local politicians are tweeting about it." Maya pinched the bridge of her nose, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her. "This is bigger than me," she said after a moment. "This is about everyone who's ever been humiliated or violated like I was today. If this video can start a conversation, if it can lead to real change, then I'm all in." "So what's the plan?" Emma asked. Maya paused. She had spent her career defending clients in court, but this was different. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a public fight for accountability. "First, I'm filing a formal complaint against both officers," she said firmly. "And I want to know everything about them: disciplinary records, complaints, lawsuits. If they've done this before, I'll find it." "Got it," Emma said. "I'll start digging. And I need to speak to the man who filmed the video," Maya continued. "He said he'd send it to me, but I want to thank him personally, and make sure he's okay with it being used if this goes to court." "I'll track him down," Emma promised. "But Maya, this isn't going to be easy. You know that, right? They're going to fight back. They'll try to paint you as the problem." Maya's jaw tightened. "Let them try. I'm not backing down." The next morning, Maya walked into her office, her heels clicking against the polished wood floors. The space was quiet, but Emma was already at her desk, typing furiously on her laptop. "Morning," Maya said, setting her briefcase down. Emma looked up, her expression a mix of excitement and concern. "Morning. I've got something." Maya leaned over Emma's desk as she pulled up a file. "Officer Mark Reynolds. He's the one who pulled you over, right?" "Yeah," Maya said, her chest tightening at the sound of his name. Emma clicked on a tab, bringing up a list of complaints filed against Reynolds over the past 5 years. "He has a history," she said. "Excessive use of force. Racial profiling. There's even a lawsuit from a black teacher who says he stopped her while she was walking home from the grocery store and accused her of shoplifting. She settled out of court. Maya's stomach churned. And he's still on the force. Emma shrugged, her frustration evident. Most of the complaints were dismissed for lack of evidence. The lawsuit was sealed as part of the settlement. But I'm guessing this isn't his first time pulling over someone who doesn't look like they belong. Maya nodded slowly, her mind racing. This needs to come out. People need to know who he really is. Agreed, Emma said. But that's not all. She pulled up another document, this one tied to the car Maya had been driving. Your BMW, it's flagged, Emma said carefully. Maya frowned. Flagged? What do you mean? There's a record tied to the vehicle's VIN number, Emma explained. Apparently, it was reported as part of a robbery a few years ago. Maya froze. That's impossible. I bought that car new from the dealership. Emma bit her lip. I'm not saying it makes sense, but the record's there. It could explain why Reynolds stopped you in the first place, assuming he ran the plates before pulling you over. Maya sank into her chair, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. So that's what this was about, she muttered. He saw the flag and assumed I was guilty. And instead of investigating like a professional, he went straight to harassment. It gets worse, Emma said, her voice hesitant. Maya looked up sharply. What now? The record doesn't just say the car was linked to a robbery, Emma said. It says it was used as a getaway vehicle in an armed robbery. And the case is still open. Maya felt the blood drain from her face. They think I'm connected to a robbery? Emma shook her head quickly. No, there's nothing tying you to it. But the car's history might be enough to cast doubt. If they decide to retaliate against you for filing that complaint. Maya exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. They can try, she said, her voice hardening. But they're not going to scare me off. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about holding them accountable. For everything. Emma nodded, her admiration clear. What do you want to do next? Maya's eyes burned with resolve. We fight. Hard. Maya adjusted her blazer, trying to focus as she entered the office of Detective Sandra Harlow. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee, and the walls were lined with corkboards cluttered with case files, photographs, and sticky notes. It was a stark reminder that the justice system wasn't as pristine as courtroom dramas made it seem. Sandra Harlow, a no-nonsense detective with sharp eyes and a reputation for playing by the book, gestured for Maya to sit. Ms. Carter, she said, her voice even but curious, I wasn't expecting a defense attorney in my office today. What can I do for you? Maya settled into the chair across from her desk. I'm here because I believe my car has been mistakenly flagged in connection to an armed robbery. Sandra raised an eyebrow, leaning back in her chair. Mistakenly flagged? That's not something we hear often. Let me pull up the records. As Sandra typed into her computer, Maya's pulse quickened. The room felt stifling, the walls too close. Finally, Sandra's face tightened as she scanned the screen. Your car, a 2021 black BMW, was flagged because its VIN number matches a vehicle that was reported as a getaway car in a 2022 robbery at a high-end jewelry store downtown. The suspects got away with over $500,000 in stolen merchandise. Maya's stomach churned. That can't be right, she said. I bought that car new from the dealership in 2021. There's no way it was involved in a robbery. Sandra tilted her head, studying her. It's possible the car's VIN number was cloned. Maya frowned. Cloned? What does that mean? Car thieves sometimes duplicate VIN numbers from legitimate vehicles and use them on stolen cars to make them seem legitimate, Sandra explained. It's a way to launder stolen vehicles. If your car's VIN was cloned, the vehicle involved in the robbery could have been sold on the black market or used as a disposable car. Maya felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. So if this is just a case of cloning, why am I still being treated like a suspect? Sandra's eyes narrowed slightly. You're not a suspect, not officially. But when we run a flagged VIN and see a match, it raises questions. If the car involved in the robbery hasn't been recovered, it's hard to tell which is the legitimate vehicle. But I have proof of ownership, Maya countered, her voice rising slightly. I have my purchase receipt, my registration, my insurance, everything. Why didn't the officer who pulled me over check any of that before treating me like a criminal? Sandra sighed, leaning forward. Look, I'm not here to defend Officer Reynolds' behavior. If what I saw in that video is accurate, he was out of line. Out of line? Maya snapped. He humiliated me in public. He went through my things without cause. This isn't just about a bad cop, it's about a broken system that lets people like him get away with it. Sandra held her gaze, unflinching. I hear you. But if you want my help clearing this up, you need to give me time. I'll dig into the VIN cloning angle and cross-reference the robbery file to see what we're missing. Maya stood, smoothing her skirt. Thank you, Detective Harlow. I appreciate your help. But just so we're clear, this isn't something I'm letting go. Not until the truth comes out. Sandra nodded, her expression softening slightly. Fair enough. Back at her office, Maya pored over the documents Emma had compiled on Officer Reynolds. Her assistant sat across from her desk, chewing on the end of her pen. So Reynolds didn't run your plates until after he pulled you over, Emma said, scrolling through the dashcam footage she'd managed to obtain through a public records request. He stopped you because of the car you were driving, not because of the robbery flag. Maya leaned back in her chair, the weight of the realization sinking in. He profiled me, she said bitterly. He saw a black woman in a luxury car and assumed I didn't belong. Emma nodded grimly. And he thought he'd get away with it because that's what always happens. Maya tapped her fingers against the desk, her mind racing. Then we make sure he doesn't get away with it this time. Emma hesitated, her eyes flicking to the folder of documents on the desk. Maya, I need to tell you something. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, but... Maya sat up straighter, her heart skipping a beat. What is it? Emma opened another file, this one marked with the logo of the FBI. The jewelry store robbery? It wasn't just a random heist. The FBI believes it was part of a larger operation, something involving money laundering and stolen goods being funneled out of the country. Maya's eyebrows shot up. And my car is tied to this? Emma nodded. Indirectly, yes. If the car's VIN was cloned and used in the operation, it's possible someone's trying to cover their tracks. Which means you might not have been stopped at random, Maya. A chill ran down her spine. You think this goes deeper than Reynolds profiling me? Emma hesitated. I don't know. But the timing is suspicious. That officer didn't just humiliate you. He went through your briefcase, your files. What if he wasn't just looking for proof you owned the car? What if he was looking for something else? Maya's pulse quickened as she replayed the scene in her mind, the way Reynolds had rifled through her belongings with an almost desperate edge. She had assumed it was about control, about asserting power. But what if Emma was right? If someone's trying to frame me, Maya said slowly, they picked the wrong target. I'm not going down without a fight. Later that night, Maya sat in her living room, her laptop open in front of her. The video of her encounter with Reynolds was still circulating online, gaining traction with every passing hour. But now, the comments carried a different weight. There's more to this than what we're seeing. Why hasn't the police department issued a statement? This isn't just about racism, it's about corruption. Maya scrolled through the messages, her determination growing with every word. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced, every victim of systemic injustice who never got the chance to tell their story. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Detective Harlow. I found something. We need to talk. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Maya stared at the message, her mind racing. Whatever Sandra had uncovered, it was about to take this fight to a whole new level. Maya arrived at the precinct the next morning, her heels clicking sharply against the polished tile floors. The air inside felt cold and sterile, the hum of ringing phones and muffled conversations setting a tense backdrop. She clutched her briefcase tightly, a storm of questions swirling in her mind. Detective Sandra Harlow greeted her at the entrance to her office. Her expression was serious, almost grim. Thanks for coming, Sandra said, motioning for Maya to follow her inside. Maya sat down across from Sandra's desk, her posture stiff. You said you found something? Sandra nodded, opening a manila folder and sliding it across the desk. I pulled the original robbery case file tied to your car's VIN number. Something about it didn't sit right with me, so I dug a little deeper. What I found raises more questions than answers. Maya opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents inside. There were grainy surveillance photos of a black BMW parked outside a jewelry store, time-stamped from the night of the robbery. Her car, or at least a car identical to hers. "This is the car that was used?" Maya asked, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. Sandra nodded. "It matches the description witnesses gave, and its plates were linked to the getaway. But here's where it gets strange. There's no record of the car being recovered. It disappeared after the robbery, like it just vanished." Maya frowned, her lawyer's instincts kicking in. "So how does this tie back to me? My car was never involved." Sandra leaned forward, lowering her voice. "That's where things get murky. The dealership where you bought your car? It's under investigation for potential VIN cloning. They've sold at least a dozen vehicles in the last 3 years that were later flagged in connection to crimes. Some of those cars were legitimate, but others, not so much." Maya felt the weight of the words sink in. "You're saying I might have bought a car with a cloned VIN?" Sandra nodded. "It's possible. But there's more. One of the suspects in the robbery, someone the FBI has been watching, has ties to the dealership." Maya's jaw tightened. "Let me guess. None of this was disclosed to the public." Sandra exhaled. "It's an active investigation. The FBI is keeping a tight lid on it. But here's the thing, Maya. Your car being flagged isn't just a coincidence. If someone at that dealership is involved in criminal activity, they might have deliberately sold you a car tied to the robbery to cover their tracks. And that brings me to my next point." Sandra pulled out another document and handed it to Maya. It was a detailed log of Officer Reynolds' patrols over the last 6 months. "Reynolds has stopped multiple cars purchased from that same dealership," Sandra said. "Mostly black or Hispanic drivers in high-end vehicles. Some of those stops led to arrests, but others didn't." Maya's eyes narrowed as she scanned the report. "You're saying he's targeting specific drivers?" Sandra nodded. "I can't prove it yet, but it's a pattern. And in your case, it's possible someone tipped him off about your car. Maybe they wanted him to find something, or plant something." Maya's breath caught. "Plant something? You think they were trying to frame me?" Sandra hesitated. "I don't know for sure. But if you've got enemies, people who don't like the cases you've taken on, it's not out of the question." Maya sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She thought of the high-profile cases she had worked on, the powerful people she had gone up against. It wasn't impossible to imagine someone wanting revenge. "I need to see everything you have on this," Maya said finally. "The dealership, Reynolds, the robbery, everything." Sandra nodded. "I can't give you the full case file, but I'll share what I can. Just be careful, Maya. If someone's trying to set you up, they won't stop here." Later that afternoon, Maya sat in her office, her laptop open as she combed through the documents Sandra had sent. The more she read, the clearer the picture became. Reynolds wasn't just a bad cop, he was part of a larger web of corruption. Emma knocked on the door, stepping inside with a cautious expression. "You look like you're about to explode," she said, setting a coffee on Maya's desk. Maya gestured to the papers scattered across her desk. "Emma, this is bigger than I thought. Reynolds has been targeting drivers from that dealership for months. And the dealership itself? It's a front for something much bigger. Money laundering, stolen goods, you name it." Emma sank into the chair opposite her. "Okay, but what does this have to do with you?" Maya paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sandra thinks someone might have deliberately sold me that car. Maybe they wanted to use it as a scapegoat, tie me to the robbery, and take me down." Emma's eyes widened. "You think this is personal?" "I don't know," Maya admitted. "But if it is, I'm not going to sit around and wait for them to make the next move. We need to get ahead of this." Emma nodded slowly. "So what's the plan?" Maya leaned forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "First, we expose Reynolds. His record, his behavior, everything. I want the whole city to see who he really is. Second, we investigate the dealership. If they've been selling cloned cars, there has to be a paper trail. And third," she hesitated, her voice softening, "we find out who's behind this. And why they're coming after me. That evening, as Maya drove home, the weight of everything pressed down on her. The headlights of oncoming cars blurred in her vision, the city lights reflecting off the windshield. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She glanced at it and saw a text from an unknown number. "You should stop digging. It won't end well for you." Maya's grip on the steering wheel tightened, her breath catching in her throat. She pulled over to the side of the road, her heart pounding. The message was a clear warning, a threat. She stared at the text for a long moment before deleting it. Whoever had sent it didn't know who they were dealing with. Maya Carter didn't back down. Maya stood in front of a packed room, the hum of murmurs filling the air as journalists, activists, and community members waited for her to speak. Cameras flashed, and microphones lined the podium. The video of her encounter with Officer Reynolds had become a flashpoint for conversations about racial profiling, systemic corruption, and accountability. But for Maya, this moment wasn't just about what had happened to her, it was about everything she had uncovered since that day. She adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "My name is Maya Carter, and I am here today not just as a victim of injustice, but as someone who refuses to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing." The crowd quieted, the weight of her words settling over them. "What happened to me 2 weeks ago wasn't an isolated incident," she continued. "It was part of a larger pattern, a system that allows officers like Mark Reynolds to target individuals based on the color of their skin, without accountability or consequences." Maya's eyes scanned the room, locking briefly on Emma, who gave her an encouraging nod from the back. "But what started as a case of racial profiling uncovered something much bigger," Maya said, her voice growing stronger. "In the course of investigating my own experience, I discovered a web of corruption that stretches from a single police officer to an entire network of criminal activity. And today, I'm here to tell you the truth." She paused, letting the tension build. "The car I was driving that day, the car that Officer Reynolds claimed was suspicious, was flagged because of a VIN cloning scheme tied to a local dealership. This dealership has been laundering money, selling stolen vehicles, and using innocent customers as scapegoats to cover their tracks. And Officer Reynolds? He wasn't acting alone. He was part of this system, targeting specific drivers to ensure their silence or complicity." Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by furious scribbling from reporters. "The evidence speaks for itself," Maya said, gesturing to a stack of documents on the table beside her. "Financial records, patrol logs, and eyewitness accounts all point to one conclusion. This wasn't just a case of racial profiling. This was a coordinated effort to protect criminals at the expense of innocent people." The days leading up to the press conference had been a whirlwind. After receiving the threatening text, Maya had gone straight to Sandra Harlow, who agreed to help her uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. "Whoever sent that message wants you to back off," Sandra had said, her tone sharp with frustration. "But we're not going to let them intimidate you." Together, they had pored over dealership records, subpoenaed documents, and followed the money trail. What they found was damning: a ring of criminals working out of the dealership, using VIN cloning to move stolen cars and launder money. Officer Reynolds had been receiving kickbacks for stopping and harassing drivers whose cars could be tied back to the scheme, ensuring the real culprits stayed in the shadows. "Reynolds isn't smart enough to be running this on his own," Sandra had said during one late-night meeting. "He's a pawn. We need to find the king." Their breakthrough came when they uncovered an offshore bank account tied to the dealership's owner, Alan Trask, who had been quietly funneling money out of the country for years. "This is it," Maya had said, her hands trembling as she held the printout of the bank records. "This ties everything together." As Maya wrapped up her speech at the press conference, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. For weeks, she had been carrying the weight of humiliation, fear, and anger. But now, standing in front of the world, she was reclaiming her power. "This isn't just my fight," she said, her voice unwavering. "This is our fight. For every person who has ever been stopped for looking like they didn't belong. For every family torn apart by a corrupt system. For every voice that's been silenced. This ends now." The crowd erupted into applause, but Maya barely heard it. Her mind was already racing ahead, thinking about the work still to be done. Later that evening, Maya sat in her apartment, scrolling through the flood of news coverage. The press conference had been a success. The dealership had been shut down, Alan Trask was in custody, and Officer Reynolds had been suspended pending further investigation. Sandra had assured her that more arrests were coming. But for Maya, the victory felt bittersweet. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Emma. "Turn on the news." "No." Maya grabbed the remote and flipped to the local station. A reporter stood outside the police precinct, her expression grim. "Breaking news tonight. Officer Mark Reynolds, the officer at the center of a racial profiling scandal, was found dead in his home earlier this evening in what police are calling an apparent suicide. Sources say Reynolds left behind a note claiming he was coerced into targeting drivers and feared for his life if he spoke out." Maya's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the screen, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Reynolds wasn't just corrupt. He had been a pawn in a much larger game, a game that had cost him everything. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Sandra. "I just heard," Sandra said when Maya answered. "This complicates things." "You think he was killed?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sandra hesitated. "It's possible. Or maybe he was just in too deep and didn't see a way out. Either way, this isn't over, Maya. Whoever's behind this is still out there." Maya nodded slowly, her resolve hardening. "Then we keep going. We keep digging. They don't get to win." In the weeks that followed, Maya's life became a whirlwind of interviews, court filings, and late-night strategy sessions. The FBI's investigation into the dealership expanded, uncovering even more layers of corruption. Maya became a vocal advocate for police reform, using her platform to push for accountability and transparency. But even as the victories piled up, she knew the fight was far from over. One evening, as she sat in her office, Emma walked in with a small envelope. "This was delivered for you," Emma said, setting it on the desk. Maya frowned, opening the envelope cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words scrawled in bold, black ink. "We're watching you." "Stop." Maya's hands trembled, but she quickly steadied herself. She folded the note and placed it in her desk drawer. "They don't scare me," she said quietly, more to herself than to Emma. Emma gave her a worried look. "Maya, you've done enough. You've already made a difference. Maybe it's time to—" "No," Maya interrupted, her voice firm. "If I stop now, they win. And I won't let that happen." Emma nodded, a mixture of admiration and concern in her eyes. As Maya looked out the window at the city lights, she felt a flicker of hope. The fight was far from over, but she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever.